Okay, so let's talk about the Aseret Hadibrot a little bit. Make sure we address it. Always the danger of talking about the parts of the parsha that are less well known, and then you don't do any justice to the parts that you should at least talk about once. Okay, so I was going over last night and today. I think it was 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. The first essay. Have you read Mosaic magazine? Have you ever seen articles in it? It's Tikva's long form essay. They put out one essay a month with responses. So I think they first started, when I was still a fellow. So the first one they came out with was a series on the Aseret Hadibrot, which was a main article by Leon Katz with respondents by politicians, by political thinkers, Peter Berkowitz, and Christians like Gil Meilander, rabbis like Meir Soloveitchik. He's always interesting, Katz. He doesn't always present a traditional approach, but he is someone who has tremendous respect for the Torah. One of the insights that I'm really struck by in it, and I knew it. We all know it. I told you, as soon as I tell you, you all know that this is true. That doesn't mean that we process the importance of it. How many of the thing we call the Aseret Hadibrot are positive, and how many are negative? So it depends if we count, right? Obviously, if we count 10 and we count Anochi, so then 7, 2, and 1. I don't know if Anochi Hashem Elokech really counts as I don't know how you categorize it. Let's call it a mitzvah aseh, then you'll get 7 and 3, right? If you think it's more of an introduction, then which it functions in both levels. But it really is quite striking that this glorified, amazing introduction that God gives us in the Aseret Hadibrot is at least 7 out of 10, if we take it as 10 prohibitions, right? The entire second half is all prohibitions, and even the first half is 2, at least, prohibitions, right? Don't worship idols and don't take God's name in vain. Now, that's interesting both because you have to ask what that tells you about the Aseret Hadibrot in general. It's also interesting because it forces you to ask about the exceptions. Right, so let's leave Anochi Hashem Elokecha out because, okay, even if it's mitzvah aseh, it's clearly mitzvah aseh that functions as an introduction. Okay? But let's try to take both points. So first of all, if the majority of the Aseret Hadibrot are prohibitions, what does it tell you about the Aseret Hadibrot that the 2 lengthiest mitzvot described in it are the positives and the lengthiest, right, and the longest, meaning Shabbat and Kibbut Avim? What does that tell you? Because that seems to, what? Okay, Shabbat is definitely the longest. Compared to the second half, that's not true, because remember that 4 of them are very short. Right? Lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov. So Kavod Avicha v'Rimecha is still longer than that, but fine, okay. Fine. Why is Shabbat, which is one of the 2 positives, also the longest by far, right, of the descriptions, right? Meaning this does seem to be is also, I don't know, I think Shabbat is still longer. I think. I'm not sure. We can go and count words. I don't, the point stands whether it's longer. The fact that most of them are negative, and then you have a long discourse on Shabbos, and then you have Kibbut Avim as being Nazeh, does seem to ask, okay, well, what is the importance of that, right? That it does, right? The second is the broader question, which is, why is it that the majority of the Aseret Hadibrot are, in fact, prohibitions? Okay, well, which of those do you want to start with? Let's take that. Which one do you want to start with? What? Why? Why prohibitions? Okay. So why prohibitions? So, it's hard to figure out for sure. But in one of those responses, Michael Fishbane, who's like a ancient Near East scholar, suggests something that I think is quite plausible, and builds on things that I've mentioned throughout the year. But we'll say it again in the context here. So, one of the points that many ancient Near East scholars have pointed out, and this becomes central to Professor Berman loves this. He talks about it a lot in all his books. Is that in many ways the Aseret Hadibrot in specific and much of the Torah in general is written in similar style to the ancient suzerain contracts. Right? What was a suzerain contract, or what are these treaties? So basically you had a super king who would do a service for a lesser king, right? Save them in war, right? Think about in Tanakh how often people are scared of war, so they go to a superpower, pledge allegiance, and say, if you come and save me from this threat, then I'll pay you taxes, whether that be Assyria or Mitzrayim. And half of Navi is the Nevi'im yelling at Bnei Israel for making these contracts with either Assyria or Mitzrayim. And if you read these contracts, so they have very similar structures. They start with an introduction by the king, a historical explanation of the relationship, how the relationship came into being between the suzerain, or the head king, and the vassal king, what kindness he did to the vassal king to deserve his allegiance, then the terms of the contract, the things he has to do for the king, followed by blessings and curses of what happens if you don't follow the contract. Okay? So many have pointed out that the Torah, especially the Aseret Hadibrot, follow that. Right? Introduction of the king, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, description of the relationship that led to the allegiance, right? Lo Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Tzeticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, the rules that you have to follow, and consequences for those rules, right? Just in the Aseret Hadibrot, you get that if you keep the mitzvah, then what? I'll give you good to the third and fourth generation. If you don't, other way around. If you're bad, I will punish the third and fourth generation. And if you're good, so it'll be good for thousands of generations. Right? And obviously later on you get more. You actually get the brachot and the kolot. Now, what's the import of that? So one of the central theses that Dr. Berman has in his book, Created Equal, is that the biggest chiddush of this, there are a lot of chiddushim of understanding this way, but perhaps the biggest chiddush of this is that in the ancient world, these treaties were between the king and the vassal king. Right? If that's the case, then the biggest chiddush of the Torah, right? Because the only people worth having these deals with were kings. The chiddush of the Torah is that who gets to be the vassal king? Every individual Jew. Right? Which means that the Torah elevates the average person to the level of king, which in the ancient world was not true, because the only people who had any interaction with the divine were the kings, the priests, the upper echelons of society. The average person didn't. Right? You were obedient to the king, maybe to the priest, who in turn were the intermediaries, and that doesn't happen here. So that's Dr. Berman's big chiddush on it, right? That's why the book is called Created Equal, right? One of his biggest themes in the book is this point, is that the theology of the Torah is that every person deserves that direct relationship and therefore elevated to kingship, which is part of why the Torah promotes equality by raising everybody up. And this is related to the fact that the king is demoted in Torah, right? Where the king's main responsibility is to read Torah. No, in Chumash is to read the Torah. is to make sure that he doesn't become too powerful and that he carries around the Torah and reads it all the time. Meaning, we elevate everybody to king, and we say that the king, just like everybody else, is to keep the Torah. Your main responsibility is to not aggrandize yourself too much over the people and make sure you're constantly reading Torah. With that insight, though, which I think is a very important insight in general into the Aseret Hadibrot, and maybe I'll encourage Dr. Berman to develop his whole thesis there, or encourage, as I have in the past, for you to read Created Equal and all his books, whatever. Nothing new about me encouraging you to read his books. But Michael Fishbein makes a very interesting point, which connects to it. And he says that might be the reason that the Aseret Hadibrot are primarily negative. Because if you understand that because what were the purpose of these treaties, or as they were written? It was less about the content and more about obedience, right? Meaning the whole point of this relationship is to say, I am the suzerain, the top king. You owe me your allegiance, right? That's the justification for everything I'm going to say from now on, is the fact that because I did something for you, you are now loyal to me. In that context, Fishbein argues, well, it makes a lot of sense that the main commandments would be negative, because you may also have positive ones. But in the end of the day, the fact that you are limited in what you can do, right? No, is a much greater expression of authority, right? And a demand of obedience. It's not, so that explains in general the negatives. It also happens to explain the introduction negative, which, as Gavi notes, is, besides for Shabbos, or maybe including Shabbos, we have to count the words, the longest negative in it, which is what? Yes, bracketing what we count Anochi as, yes. So, Lo yeh lecha Elohim achirim al panai. Okay, so Shabbos is slightly longer, but even that, why is that one the longest of the negatives? Because that's the main point, right? Meaning, what frames the rest of the responsibility is, I am God, who you have allegiance to, and you better not give your allegiance to somebody else. Right? That's like the framing for everything else. Right? Lo yeh lecha Elohim achirim al panai, because Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hochteich me'eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, so maybe we'll have to suffice with these collection of insights. First, Dr. Berman's point, Many's point, but he's the Frum version, so I'll go with him, right? Which is that the Torah is, in many ways, speaking to a world in which they would have recognized these contracts, which are between a suzerain and the vassal kings, which elevate the Jews to king, right? To kings, loyal to God, but as monarchs, right? And therefore, it both demands obedience while granting dignity to every individual Jew in really radical ways. The way it does that is by setting it up like this treaty, which is, I'm God, you owe me allegiance because I saved you, which means that you are now loyal to me. And the primary responsibility, which you get right after Anochi, therefore, is don't have allegiance to anyone else. But as Fishbein argues, once you have that background, it makes sense that the Aseret Hadibrot, which less than being a collection of the laws, that comes more in Mishpatim, is sort of the introduction to this loyalty, is going to have a lot more demands, which often come in negatives. What we'll deal with next time is, okay, once you have that, which makes sense, right, that this is right primarily about allegiance to God in light of what he did, which sets the groundwork for Mishpatim and Truma and Tzava and everything after it. So then you got to ask, why then the exceptions? Right? Once you've done that, then why is it that the two positives that make it into this allegiance are Shabbat and Kibbut Avim, which is particularly shocking considering that one of those two actually demands allegiance to somebody other than God, which should really surprise you when you think about the importance of allegiance in this framing. So we'll do that, I guess, on Thursday, okay?